The screams of helplessness echoed through the hall, so chilling that even the most hardened of soldiers turned pale. These weren't the cries of war, but of those who were once the most coveted men in ancient Greece. Male concubines, prized for their beauty and youth, were forced into a life of unimaginable cruelty, their worth dictated only by their appearance. For a brief moment they were adored, the ultimate symbol of power and wealth, but as time wore on and their beauty faded, they were discarded with a cold, ruthless finality. Their lives, once filled with luxury, became a silent hell where they were abandoned by those who once worshipped them. In the next few minutes you'll discover the horrifying truth about these men, hidden for centuries in ancient records and texts. It's a reality so dark that the wealth and power of the elite cannot shield them from the terrifying consequences of their abandonment. But when their beauty was gone, what became of these men? How far did the elite go to rid themselves of those they once called their treasures? The truth, buried deep in history, reveals a fate more brutal than you can imagine. If you were disturbed by what you just heard, you're not alone. Too many are unaware of this painful truth. But you can change that. Hit like and subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be told, and it's time we stop letting history hide its darkest secrets. You owe it to these forgotten men to shed light on their suffering. Now let's uncover the rest of their tragic tale. The chilling truth about the male concubines in ancient Greece has been buried beneath centuries of forgotten records and whispers, lost in the shadows of history. What I'm about to reveal comes from ancient scrolls and scholarly research that have long been ignored. These men, once the prized possessions of the wealthy elite, weren't just discarded when their beauty faded. They were subjected to a fate more horrifying than anyone dares to imagine. At first, they were adored, living symbols of power and prestige. Their youth and beauty were the ultimate currency, elevating them to positions of influence and privilege. They were pampered, cherished, and used in the most intimate ways by the most powerful men in society. But what happened when that beauty began to fade? Their fall from grace wasn't just about losing their looks. It was about being entirely erased from existence. As soon as their youth was gone, these men became expendable. They were no longer seen as valuable. Their worth diminished to the point of nothingness. The luxury they once enjoyed vanished, replaced by a life of brutal neglect. They were discarded by those who once praised them, left in the dark corners of history and forced to endure unimaginable suffering. What you're about to learn will shatter your perception of ancient Greece. This wasn't just about losing power or status. This was a systematic destruction of their bodies and spirits. These men were not just forgotten, they were punished in the most brutal ways, their suffering hidden from the very society that had once revered them. And this is only the beginning of their torment. The truth behind their abandonment is darker than you think. But what's even more disturbing is how this all ties back to the very system that created them. A system that both elevated them to unimaginable heights and, when their worth faded, cast them into a life of torment. Let's rewind to the moment when it all began. Picture this, 4th century BCE, the heart of Athens. The city, bathed in the glow of its golden age, was a place where philosophy flourished and political power was built on the backs of its most prized symbols, its youth. The male concubines of the elite, once seen as the ultimate status symbols, lived a life of luxury and comfort. They were adored for their beauty, their bodies seen as trophies, their every need provided for by the powerful families who claimed them. These young men were not just lovers, they were instruments of power. Their beauty and youth served as bargaining chips in the political games of the elite. They lived in the shadows of Athenian politics, adored by the rich and powerful, their every move watched but never truly free. To be a male concubine in ancient Greece was to be both desired and disposable. They existed at the pinnacle of power, yet trapped in a world where their worth was only as long as their youth lasted. The air in Athens was thick with political tension. The city, at the peak of its glory, was also teetering on the edge of profound change. The once stable system that upheld the lives of these men was about to be shaken. The ruling elite, whose very wealth and power depended on control over the youth they possessed, was on the brink of a shift that would alter everything. Power struggles, changing alliances, and the rise of new leaders would soon turn the lives of the concubines upside down. The men who had once been sought after, pampered, and revered for their physical beauty were about to become something entirely different. As the balance of power shifted, these men, who had enjoyed luxury, would face a horrifying reality. When their beauty began to fade, they were no longer useful. What happened next would set the course for their tragic fall, a fate so cruel, it's almost beyond belief. But what's even more disturbing is that their downfall wasn't random. It was the inevitable result of the very system that created them, a system built on the exploitation of power, beauty, and the destruction of those who could no longer serve. Before this moment, these men were celebrated for their beauty and influence. To be a male concubine in ancient Greece was to be a living symbol of wealth, power, and status. They were revered by kings, philosophers, and politicians alike, their youth and allure used as the ultimate bargaining chips in the games of the elite. The more beautiful they were, the more they were worshipped. They were prized possessions, their every desire catered to, their lives a reflection of the grandeur that surrounded them. In those early days, they lived a life of luxury, surrounded by opulence, admired by all who had the power to claim them. Their bodies, sculpted by youth, were their greatest asset, and they used them with skill, charm, and an understanding of their immense worth. For a time, they were untouchable, sitting at the highest tables, moving between the elite like kings in their own right. The eyes of the world were on them, and they knew no other life but one of adoration. But as time passed, their beauty, once so dazzling, began to fade. The very thing that had made them invaluable to the elite, their youth, was slipping away, and with it, so too was their worth. No longer the stunning creatures who graced the halls of the wealthy, they became shadows of their former selves. Afterward, they were nothing more than broken, forgotten souls, cast aside as their value diminished. The lavish banquets, the endless attention, and the life of luxury were all distant memories. In their place was a painful existence, where they were no longer cherished but abandoned. As they grew older, their bodies no longer held the same allure, and the elite, once their worshippers, now saw them as expendable, their lives discarded like the remnants of a once glorious feast. Historians now believe the trauma these men experienced left deep psychological scars. The emotional toll of being worshipped and then tossed aside led many to a tragic end. Their worth had been so intimately tied to their physical beauty, and when that faded, so did their purpose. For many, the transition from worshipped concubine to discarded object was too much to bear. Yet even after all they endured, many still clung to one last shred of hope. But that hope would soon be crushed in the most brutal way imaginable, as their very existence became a source of shame rather than honor. But that was just the beginning. The men who had once been adored and revered were now slowly losing everything. Their beauty, once their greatest asset, began to fade, and with it their worth in a world that only valued them for their youth. What followed was a descent into unimaginable torment that lasted far longer than anyone could have predicted. Abuse and manipulation soon became part of their daily existence. Once treated like royalty, the concubines were now humiliated, discarded, and betrayed. No longer wanted by those who once worshipped them, they were forced to endure degrading tasks, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink. They had no control over their lives. They were treated as mere objects, their identities erased with each passing day. The torment, not for days or weeks, but for years, left them hollow inside. They were the victims of a society that had only seen them as valuable while their beauty remained intact. Once their looks faded, they were abandoned to a life of despair. Their spirits were crushed as they endured the slow, agonizing realization that they had been used up and cast aside. The abuse was relentless, each day more brutal than the last. According to ancient texts, many concubines were discarded like old furniture once their beauty had faded. But their fate wasn't just about neglect, it was about cruelty. Many were sold, forced into hard labor, or left to rot in the shadows of the very society that had once revered them. They were pushed to the edges of existence, forgotten and forsaken by everyone they had known. Some were left to suffer in ways you could never imagine, their bodies breaking, their minds unraveling as they were forced to live in the most degrading conditions. But the worst part of their lives was yet to come, a final act of cruelty that would push them past the point of no return. What you're learning today isn't something most people will ever hear, so if this has opened your eyes, don't let it stay in the shadows. Hit that like button and share this truth, because these men's stories deserve to be remembered. There's still so much more to uncover, and the revelations ahead will change the way you think about ancient Greece forever. Here's something historians don't teach you. Some of these male concubines were not just passive figures in the background of Athenian society, they were once powerful political players in their own right. Before their fall, many were influential figures, often involved in high-stakes decisions and affairs of state. These men weren't just trophies, they were at the heart of political machinations, playing a dangerous game with the elite. And the real twist? Male concubines sometimes wielded power over affairs of state for a price. As the favored lovers of powerful politicians, some of these men were given access to private councils, where they held sway over critical decisions. They weren't just seen as desirable for their looks, they were used as pawns in the ruthless games of power, exchanging affection and loyalty for influence and favors. But this was no fairy tale. The very thing that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. These concubines were kept on a tight leash, their power fleeting and always tied to the whims of those in control. Their worth was tied to their ability to maintain their beauty and usefulness, and the moment they were no longer seen as valuable, they were discarded without hesitation. But that power came at a dangerous cost, one that would haunt them, pushing them into an abyss from which they could never return. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about their roles in society. The price of power was not just personal, it was a trap that led to their inevitable destruction. By 300 BCE, many of the once adored concubines had become mere shadows of their former selves. The years of abuse, neglect, and abandonment had stripped them of their vitality and beauty. No longer the living symbols of power and wealth, they had been discarded by those who once revered them. Their once glorious bodies were now frail, their spirits broken by a lifetime of torment. One ancient record described a concubine who, in his final days, was left to rot in a dark room, forgotten by all who had once lavished him with attention. His body had withered, his beauty had faded, and now he was nothing more than a ghost of his former self. In the silence of his final hours, no one came to comfort him. No one mourned his passing. He died alone, abandoned in the very place that had once been a palace to him. As their suffering grew, they were abandoned in their final days, with no one left to mourn them. The concubines who had once been at the heart of the Athenian elite were now invisible to society. The rich, the powerful, they were too busy with their own concerns to care for these men who had once been their lovers, their confidants, their closest allies. It was as if they had never existed. The world had moved on, leaving the concubines to fade into oblivion. In the end, the concubines who had once wielded power, beauty, and influence were reduced to nothing but forgotten figures in the annals of history. Their bodies were abandoned, their names erased. No funeral rites, no grand memorials. Just the cold silence of a world that had used them up and cast them aside. Their fate was sealed, long before their final breath. But their end wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The psychological toll of being adored one moment and abandoned the next left scars deeper than any wound. Their spirits, shattered by the rejection, endured a fate worse than death itself. And the final twist will haunt you long after the story ends. Because the way they were forgotten, erased from history, that was the ultimate punishment. But the horror didn't end with their deaths. The brutal lives these men led were followed by even darker fates. Once their bodies ceased to function, they were discarded as though they had never mattered, their value now reduced to a cold, lifeless shell. Many of the concubines' bodies were left to decay in the corners of forgotten rooms, left to rot by those who had once worshipped them. There was no dignity, no respect for their passing, no mourning of the lives that had once been full of power and beauty. In some cases, their bodies were sold for profit to the highest bidder, their lifeless forms reduced to objects that could be bought, sold, and exploited. These men, once revered and used as tools of power, were now nothing more than commodities in death. Their bodies were paraded through the streets like objects of mockery, their lives reduced to a cruel spectacle for the amusement of those who had once cherished them. One chilling account tells of a concubine's corpse being displayed publicly, his body laid out as a grotesque reminder of what had happened to those who were once at the top of the social hierarchy. The very men who had been treated like gods in their youth were now reduced to nothing more than a macabre exhibition. But even in death they weren't allowed to rest in peace. The final indignity, their bodies were desecrated and displayed for the world to see, a stark reminder of how far they had fallen. The truth behind their posthumous fate is more disturbing than anything you've seen so far, revealing a terrifying truth about the cruelty that surrounded their entire existence. If this dark chapter in history shocked you, Just wait until you uncover the forgotten lives of young boys in ancient China, a truth long buried by those in power. Click to subscribe and keep uncovering the untold stories of the ancient world. The truth is far from over, and you won't want to miss what comes next.